About this time, my mother began to be visited by some Seventh day Adventists who had moved into a house not too far down the road from us. They would talk to her for hours at a time and leave booklets and leaflets and magazines for her to read. She read them, and Wilfred, who had started back to school after we had begun to get the relief food supplies, also read a lot. His head was forever in some book. So by this time, a Christian denomination named Seventh day Adventist began to visit Louis Little and her family. Now, the Seventh day Adventists are Protestants, right? So, they are a Christian denomination, they are a Protestant Christian denomination who observe strict dietary laws. They are known by the name Seventh day Adventist because they observe Sabbath on the seventh day of the week. That is, on Saturdays they observe Sabbath. That's why they are known as Seventh day Adventists. And they strongly believe in Christ's second coming. They believe that Christ will one day resurrect and he will come back to earth. So, second coming is a belief that Christ will return back. And Seventh day Adventist believes in doomsday and they believe that Christ will return back one day. Now, back to the passage. Before long, my mother spent much time with the Adventist. It's my belief that what most influenced her was that they had even more diet restrictions than she had taught and practiced with us. Like us, they were against eating rabbit and pork. They followed Mosaic dietary laws. So, what attracted Louis Little to the Seventh day Adventist was the fact that they observed strict dietary restrictions. If you remember, Louis Little used to follow strict dietary restrictions, and she never fed her children rabbits or anything, and even she had a fight with Earl Little over the matter of feeding the children rabbits, right? So, what attracted Louis Little to the Seventh day Adventist was the fact that they observe strong dietary restrictions. They observe strict dietary restrictions. They don't eat rabbit or pork. They ate nothing of flesh without a split hoof, or that didn't chew a cud. So they only ate red meat. They didn't consume any flesh without a split hoof. Split hoof ഇല്ലാത്ത ആനിമൽസിനെ ഒന്നും അവർ കഴിക്കാറുണ്ടായിരുന്നില്ല. കഡ് ചവയ്ക്കാത്ത ആനിമൽസിനെ ഒന്നും അവർ കഴിക്കാറുണ്ടായിരുന്നില്ല. The animals who chew cud are cows and the like, right? So they would consume red meat, but they won't consume anything and everything. They won't consume pork or rabbit, etc. We began to go with my mother to Adventist meetings that were held further out in the country. For us children, I know that the major attraction was the food they served. But we listened too. There were a handful of Negroes from small towns in the area, but I would say that it was 99% white people. So the children also went to this Adventist meetings. One of the major attraction for the children was that these Adventists would provide them with food. There were only a handful of Negroes, and these Negroes came from the nearby areas, and 99% of the population of the Seventh day Adventist comprised of white people. So the Adventists were white people, right? The Adventists felt that we were living at the end of time and that world would soon come to an end. So the Adventists believe in an apocalyptic philosophy. They believe that the world would soon come to an end and we are nearing the end. But they were the friendliest white people I had ever seen. In some ways, though, we children noticed, and when we were back at home discussed, that they were different from us, such as the lack of enough seasoning in their food and the different way that white people smelled. So these Seventh day Adventists were the friendliest lot. They were whites, but still they were the friendliest people, and the children took notice of all the small little things about the Seventh day Adventist. One of the things was that they didn't add any seasoning to their food, and they smelled different. They smelled in a way in which the white people smelled. Meanwhile, the welfare people kept after my mother. By now, she didn't make it any secret that she hated them and didn't want them in her house. But they exerted their right to come, and I many times reflected upon how, talking to us children, they began to plant the seed of division in our minds. They would ask such things as who was smarter than the other, and they would ask me why I was so different. I think they felt that getting children into foster homes was a legitimate plan of their function, and the result would be less troublesome. However, they went about it. So again, by this time, again, the welfare people began to attack the family of Louis Little. They began to keep tab on the family, and they came to their house whenever they felt like it, and they tried to separate the children. They used to ask the children who is smarter amongst you, who is smartest one, and they used to ask these questions in order to separate the children, in order to create a drift between the children, right? Their main intention was to separate these children and to place them in foster homes or in foster care, because they believe that if they are able to place the children in foster care homes, then these children would cause less trouble. And they were after Malcolm because Malcolm had a previous history of stealing. So they really wanted to place Malcolm in a foster home. And when my mother fought them, they went after her first through me. I was the first target. I stole, that implied that I wasn't being taken care of by my mother. So Louis Little hated the welfare people. The welfare people also started to attack her. And one of the ways by which welfare people started to really pester her was through Malcolm, because Malcolm had a history of stealing. So they thought that Malcolm should be put in a foster home. They implied that it is because of the mother's inability to take care of the children that Malcolm has turned into a person who steals things, into a robber of sorts. All of us were mischievous at home sometime or other, I more so than any of the rest. Wilbert and I kept a battle going, and this was just one of a dozen things that kept building up the pressure on my mother. And again, here Malcolm says that almost all the children in the house were mischievous, but the most mischievous child of the lot was Malcolm. And Filbert and Malcolm still fought with each other, so they created more tension in Louis Little's mind, because she knew that if the welfare people come to know that the children are troublesome, then they would place the children in foster care. I am not sure how or when the idea was dropped by the welfare workers that our mother was losing her mind. But I can distinctly remember hearing crazy applied to her by them when they learned that Negro Fanner, who was in the next house down the road from us, had offered to give us some butchered pork, a whole pig, maybe even two of them, and she had refused. We all heard them call my mother crazy to her face for refusing good meat. It meant nothing to them, even when she explained that we had never eaten pork, that it was against her religion as a Seventh-day Adventist. So by this time, the welfare people were trying to brand Louis Little as crazy. They applied the term crazy to Louis Little. And one of the reasons why they applied this term was that a nearby butcher had offered Louis Little some fresh pork, some good meat, some fresh pork, but she declined the pork. So they called her crazy because no woman would decline good meat, right? But then again, Louis Little tried to explain to them that she never fed her children pork, or that they never ate pork, because they were Seventh-day Adventists. So by this time, Louis Little had converted to Seventh-day Adventist church, and now since they were Seventh-day Adventists, they couldn't eat pork. That was the reason why she didn't eat pork. But the welfare workers thought that she must have been mad not to accept good quality pork from a butcher. They were as vicious as vultures. They had no feelings, understanding, compassion, or respect for my mother. They told us, she is crazy for refusing food. Right then was when our home, our unity began to disintegrate. We were having a hard time and I wasn't helping. But we could have made it. We could have stayed together. As bad as I was, as much trouble and worry I caused my mother, I loved her. So the welfare people were vicious as vultures. They had no feelings, they had no compassion. They tried to separate the children from their family, especially they tried to separate Malcolm from his family. And they used to call Malcolm's mother as crazy, and the children used to hear this name. They used to hear the welfare people calling Louis Little as crazy, and that really affected them. And since Malcolm was a very mischievous kid, that added more tension to Louis Little, that caused more trouble to Louis Little, and she began to worry about Malcolm getting separated from the rest of the children. And even though Malcolm was mischievous, he says that he still loved her. He says that he still loved his mother. The state people, we found out, had interviewed the Gohannes's family, and the Gohanneses had said that they would take me into their home. My mother threw a fit, though, when she heard that, and the home wreckers took cover for a while. So, the welfare people had interviewed the Gohannes's family to place Malcolm in their foster care. So, just before placing a child in foster care, they would interview families, prospective families. So, they wanted to place Malcolm under Gohannes's care. If you remember, in the previous lecture, I had mentioned about the Gohannes's family. They had a nephew named Big Boy, and Malcolm and Big Boy were close with each other, right? So here, the welfare people, they wanted to place Malcolm in Gohannes's family. And when Louis Little came to hear about it, when Malcolm's mother came to hear about it, she threw a fit. She got really angry at the welfare people. And since she got really angry with them, for some time they didn't visit Malcolm's house. It was about this time that the large dark man from Lansing began visiting. I don't remember how or where he and my mother met. It may have been through some mutual friends. I don't remember what the man's profession was. In 1935 in Lansing, Negroes didn't have anything you could call a profession. But the man, big and black, looked something like my father. I can't remember his name, but there is no need to mention it. He was a single man, and my mother was a widow, only 36 years old. The man was independent. Naturally, she admired that. She was having a hard time disciplining us, and a big man's presence alone would help. And if she had a man to provide, it would send the state people away forever. So by this time, Louis Little started seeing someone, and this man was a single man from Lansing. And the author does not divulge his name, maybe because he does not like to divulge his name. The man was a big black man, and he resembled Malcolm's father. And Malcolm's mother too was quite young at that time. She was only 36 years old. The man was independent. So Louis Little admired his independence. And Louis Little by this time wanted a man in the house because she wanted someone's help to discipline the children. And she thought that a man's presence would help. If there is a man in the family, then the welfare people could be kept at bay. They won't come and attack the family. We all understood without ever saying much about it, or at least we had no objection. We took it in stride, even with some amusement among us, that when the man came, our mother would be all dressed up in her best that she had. She still was a good-looking woman, and she would act differently, light-hearted and laughing, as we hadn't seen her act in years. So the children were okay with this man coming and going out of their home, and they had no objection with their mom dating a man. But what amused them was that Louis Little used to dress up for this man. She used to put makeup for this man, and she acted differently around him. She used to laugh, and she used to behave in a very light-hearted manner. And the children hadn't seen their mother like this in quite a long time. So they were quite happy about the entire arrangement. It went on for about a year, I guess, and then about 1936 or 1937, the man from Lansing jilted my mother suddenly. He just stopped coming to see her. From what I later understood, he finally backed away from taking on the responsibility of those 8 mouths to feed. He was afraid of so many of us. So the affair that Louis Little had with this man didn't last long. It just lasted for a year, and the man suddenly abandoned um, Louis Little without any warning. He stopped coming. Jilted means to reject or abandon a lover. So he rejected Louis Little, and he stopped coming to see her. From what Malcolm understood, what he felt was that the man backed away because he was not prepared to take up the responsibility of eight uh, mouths to feed. So there were eight people to feed in the family, and he was not willing to take responsibility of such a huge crowd. There were so many children, and he was not willing to take the responsibility of all the children. To this day, I can see the trap that mother was in, saddled with all of us, and I can also understand why he would shun taking on such a tremendous responsibility. So poor Malcolm says that now to this day he knows what kind of a trap that Louis Little was in. She was quite young; she was just 35 years old, but still she couldn't have a lover or a second husband for that matter, because she was weighed down by the children. No one would take up the responsibility of these kids. Hence, no one would come forward to take care of Louis Little. But it was a terrible shock to her. It was the beginning of the end of reality for my mother, when she began to sit around and walk around talking to herself, almost as though she was unaware that we were there. It became increasingly terrifying. So, when the man abandoned Louis Little, that really affected her. That was the final straw. It was a terrible shock for her, and she began to reject reality. She used to walk around the house randomly talking. She was unaware of where she was. She would just talk, and the children were terrified by the sudden change in circumstances. The state people saw her weakening. That was when they began the definite steps to take me away from home. They began to tell me how nice it would be at the Gohannes's home, when the Gohanneses and Big Boy and Mrs. Adcock had all said how much they liked me and would like to have me live with them. I liked all of them too, but I didn't want to leave Wilfred. I looked up to and admired my big brother. I didn't want to leave Hilda, who was like my second mother, or Filbert. Even in our fighting, there was a feeling of brotherly union, or Reginald especially, who was weak with his hernia condition, and who looked up to me as his big brother, who looked out for him as I looked up to Wilfred. And I nothing either against the babies, Eowyn, Wesley, and Robert. So again, here the author states how his mother slowly began to deteriorate, how her mental condition began to deteriorate. They were weakening, and the welfare people saw their mother becoming weak, and they considered this as an opportunity to place Malcolm in Johannes's care, in Johannes's home. And they used to tell him about the benefits of going to Johannes's home. They said that everyone in Johannes's home liked him, especially Big Boy and Mrs. Adhuck liked him. So here Malcolm is stating that he too liked the Johannesses, but he was not willing to part with his siblings. Right? He was not willing to part with Wilfred, whom he looked up to as the big brother, and he couldn't part with Hilda, who took care of him as a second mother. Or Filbert, with whom, even though he had many fights with Filbert, he couldn't think about parting with Filbert. Or Reginald. Reginald was his younger brother, and Reginald used to look up to him as a big brother, right? And Reginald had a hernia condition, so he was not willing to part with Reginald too. And he was not willing to part with even the babies, Joanne, Wesley, and Robert. He was, in short, he was not willing to part with any of his siblings. As my mother talked to herself more and more, she gradually became less responsive to us and less responsible. The house became less tidy. We began to be kept more unkempt, and usually now Hilda cooked. So now Their mother's condition worsened by day. Their mother's condition worsened by day. She became less responsive. She just used to talk to thin air, and she never responded to the children. She became less responsible. She didn't take care of the house. The household work was done by Hilda, and even the cooking was done by Hilda. We children watched our anger giving way. It was something terrible that you couldn't get your hands on, yet you couldn't get away from. It was a sensing that something bad was going to happen. We younger ones leaned more and more heavily on the relative strength of Wilfred and Hilda, who were the oldest. When finally I was sent to the Johannes' home, at least in a surface way, I was glad. I remember that when I left home with the state man, my mother said one thing: don't let them feed him any pig. It was better in a lot of ways at Johannes's. Big Boy and I shared a room together. We hit it off nicely. He just wasn't the same as my blood brothers. The Johanneses were very religious people. Big Boy and I attended church with them. They were sanctified holy rollers now. The preachers and congregation jumped even higher and shouted even louder than the Baptists I have known. They sang at the top of their lungs and swayed back and forth and cried and moaned and beat on tambourines and chanted. It was spooky, with ghosts and spirituals and hands seeming to be in very atmosphere when finally we came out of church going back home. The Johanneses and Mrs. Adcock loved to go fishing, and some Saturdays Big Boy and I would go along. I had changed schools now to Lansing's West Junior High. It was right in the heart of Negro community, and a few white kids were there. But Big Boy didn't match much with any of our schoolmates, and I didn't either. And when we went fishing, neither he nor I liked the idea of just sitting and waiting for the fish to jerk the cork under the water or make the tide line quiver when we fished that way. I figured there should be some smarter way to get the fish, though we never discovered what it might be. So again, this recounts how Malcolm was placed in Johannes's camp. Okay, so the slowly Louis Little and her mental health condition began to deteriorate, and the children sensed that they were slowly losing their anchor, they were slowly losing their support, and the children began to depend heavily on Wilfred and Hilda, who were the eldest. So finally, the welfare people took Malcolm to the Johannes' house, and the Johanneses were nice people. They gave him a place to stay along with Big Boy, and they were also religious folk, unlike the Adventist and any other Christian denomination like that. They too firmly believed in Christian faith. They used to chant, they used to play tambourines, they used to beat tambourine, and they used to chant. They had these spiritual chants, and the entire atmosphere of the service itself was kind of spooky. Then it talks about how Big Boy and Malcolm would attend West Junior High School together. It was at the heart of Negro community, so most of the children who went to West Junior High School were Black American kids, but there were a few white kids. Big Boy didn't form any friendship with any of the children at school. Both Big Boy and Malcolm used to go to fish together, but they were not happy with the kind of fishing that they did with the rod and the tight line. They always thought that there might have been a better way to catch fishes. Mr. Johannes was close cronies with some other men who some Saturdays would take me and Big Boy with them hunting rabbits. I had my father's .22 caliber rifle. My mother had said it was all right for me to take it with me. The old men had a set rabbit hunting strategy that they had always used. So the Johanneses were friends with some old men, and together the Johannesses, the old men, and Big Boy, along with Malcolm, would go to hunt rabbits. And at this time, Malcolm had in his possession his father's rifle, so he used to go to rabbit hunting along with these people, and even his mother was okay with taking the rifle along with him, and even his mother was okay with the arrangement. So the old men had a set strategy on how to hunt rabbits. Okay. So what was it? Usually when a dog jumps a rabbit, the rabbit gets away, and the rabbit will always somehow instinctively run in a circle and return sooner or later past the very spot where he originally was jumped. Well, the old man would just sit and wait in hiding somewhere for the rabbit to come back, when then get their shots at him. I got to thinking about it, and finally I thought of a plan. I would separate them and Big Boy, and I would go to a point where I figured that rabbit returning would have to pass me first. So this was the strategy used by the old cronies. What was that? They used to bring dog to hunt rabbit. So the dog would jump at the rabbit, the dog would scare the rabbit will run in a circle and will come back exactly to the place in which it once stood. The rabbit would run in a circle, then come back exactly at the place in which it once stood. So the hunters will be ready. They would know the mark at which the rabbit will come and stand. So they will just place the mark, and then when the rabbit comes and stands right at the point of the mark, they would kill it off. അപ്പോൾ ഇങ്ങനെയാണ് ചെയ്തുകൊണ്ടിരുന്നത്. ഒരു ഡോഗിനെ അവർ കൊണ്ടുവന്നിട്ട് അവർ ആ ഡോഗിനെ ഉപയോഗിച്ച് റാബിറ്റ്സിനെ സ്കെയർ ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ റാബിറ്റ് ഒരു സർക്കിളിൽ ഇങ്ങനെ റൺ ചെയ്തിട്ട് എവിടെ നിന്നാണോ അത് റൺ ചെയ്യാൻ തുടങ്ങിയത് എക്സാക്ട്ലി ആ പൊസിഷനിൽ തിരിച്ചു വന്നിരിക്കും. ഒരു മാർക്ക് പോലെ എക്സാക്ട്ലി ആ പൊസിഷനിൽ വന്നിരിക്കും. അപ്പോൾ ഇങ്ങനെ കറക്റ്റ് ആ പൊസിഷനിൽ വന്നിരിക്കുമ്പോൾ റാബിറ്റിനെ ഹണ്ട് ചെയ്ത് കൊല്ലുമായിരുന്നു ഈ ഓൾഡ് മെൻ. അപ്പം ഈ ഒരു സ്ട്രാറ്റജിയാണ് ഓൾഡ് മെൻ ഉപയോഗിച്ചിരുന്നത് എന്നാണ് പറയുന്നത്. റൈറ്റ്. അപ്പോൾ ഈ ഓൾഡ് മെന്നിൻ്റെ സ്ട്രാറ്റജീനെ പൊളിക്കാനായിട്ട് നമ്മുടെ മാൽക്കവും ബിഗ് ബോയും ശ്രമിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. അവരെന്താ ചെയ്യുന്നതെന്ന് വെച്ച് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ഈ റാബിറ്റ് കറക്റ്റ് അതിൻ്റെ പൊസിഷനിൽ എത്തുന്നതിന് മുന്നേ തന്നെ ആ റാബിറ്റ് കടന്നു പോകുന്ന ഒരു വഴിയുണ്ട്. ആ വഴിയിലെത്തുമ്പോൾ തന്നെ ഇവർ ആ റാബിറ്റിനെ ഷൂട്ട് ചെയ്യും. അതിങ്ങനെ ഓടിക്കൊണ്ടിരിക്കുമ്പോൾ തന്നെ ആ കടന്നു പോകുന്ന വഴിയിൽ വെച്ച് തന്നെ റാബിറ്റിനെ ഷൂട്ട് ചെയ്യും. അങ്ങനെ അവർക്ക് ആ റാബിറ്റിനെ കൊല്ലാനായിട്ട് പറ്റും. അപ്പോൾ ഈ ഒരു രീതിയിൽ നമ്മുടെ മാൽക്കം ഒരുപാട് റാബിറ്റ്സിനെ ഷൂട്ട് ചെയ്ത് വീഴ്ത്തിയിട്ടുണ്ട്. It worked like magic. I began to get 3 and 4 rabbits before they got one. The astonishing thing was that none of the old men ever figured out why. They outdid themselves, exclaiming, "What a sure shot I was." I was about 12 then. All I had done was to improve their strategy. And it was the beginning of a very important lesson in life, that anytime you find someone more successful than you are, especially when you are both engaged in the same businesses, you know they are doing something that you aren't. So again, here the old men were not able to find out the secret behind Malcolm's success on shooting the rabbits. They thought that this boy was a pro in shooting rabbits. But the reality was that Malcolm was actually trying to con the old men. He actually used the same strategy that the old men used. So one of the main lessons that Malcolm learned in those days was that if you find someone more successful than you are, especially when you are both engaged in the same business, you know they are doing something that you aren't. So if you find someone who is more successful than you doing the same business that you are doing, then the man might have been doing the business in a different way than you are doing the business. നിങ്ങൾ ഒരു കാര്യം ചെയ്തുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുകയാണ്, അതേ കാര്യം മറ്റൊരാൾ ചെയ്യുന്നു, പക്ഷെ അയാൾ ആ കാര്യത്തിൽ കുറച്ചുകൂടെ സക്സസ്ഫുൾ ആണെങ്കിൽ അയാൾ ഒരു ഡിഫറൻസോട് കൂടിയായിരിക്കും ആ ജോലി ചെയ്യുന്നത്. I would return home to visit fairly often. Sometimes Big Boy and one or another or both of the Johanses would go with me, sometimes not. I would be glad when some of them did go, because it made the ordeal easier. So he usually visited his house. Sometimes Big Boy would accompany him, or sometimes someone from the Gohans's family would accompany him. And if somebody is there with him when he went to visit his family, then he would be happy. That made the ordeal more easier because he was not fully happy with the state of affairs in his home. Soon the state people were making plans to take over all of my mother's children. She talked to herself nearly all of the time now, and there was a crowd of new white people entering the picture, always asking questions. They would even visit me at Gohannes's. They would ask me questions out on the porch or sitting out in the chair. So a plan was made by the welfare people to take all the children of Louis Little away from her, because Louis Little was becoming more and more deranged. കൂടുതൽ കൂടുതൽ mentally unstable ആയിക്കൊണ്ടിരിക്കുകയായിരുന്നു ലൂയി ലിറ്റിൽ. So more white people came and started asking questions to Malcolm. They would ask questions to him in the porch or when they were sitting in their cars. Eventually, my mother suffered a complete breakdown and the court orders were finally signed. They took her to the state mental hospital at Kalamazoo. It was 70 some miles from Lansing, about an hour and a half on bus. A Judge McClellan in Lansing had authority over me and all of my brothers and sisters. We were state children. Court words, he had the full say so over us. A white man in charge of black man's children. Nothing but legal. Modern slavery, however kindly intentioned. So slowly their mother suffered complete mental breakdown. So the court gave orders to separate the children and to place Louis Little in a mental asylum in Kalamazoo. So this mental asylum was 70 miles from Lansing. It took an hour and a half to reach the mental asylum. All the children were separated. Now they became the state children, and a judge was appointed to take care of the children. So a white man was put in charge of the state's children. So again, Malcolm considers this to be a modern slavery where a white man is in charge of black man's children. But again, this is a kindly intentioned slavery. It was for their own good. My mother remained in the same hospital at Kalamazoo for 26 years. Later, when I was all growing up in Michigan, I would go to visit her every so often. Nothing that I can imagine could have moved me as deeply as seeing her pitiful state. In 1963, we got my mother out of the hospital and she now lives there in Lansing with Philbert and his family. It was so much worse than if it had been a physical sickness for which a cause might be known, medicine given, a cure effected. Every time I visited her, when finally they led her, a case, a number back inside from where we had been sitting together, I felt worse. My last visit, when I knew I would never come to see her again, there was in 1952. I was 27. My brother Philbert had told me that on his last visit she had recognized him somewhat. In sports, he said. But she didn't recognize me at all. She stared at me. She didn't know who I was. Her mind, when I tried to talk, to reach her, was somewhere else. I asked, Mama, do you know what day it is? She said, staring. All the people have gone. I can't describe how I felt. The woman who had brought me into the world and nursed me and advised me and chastised me and loved me didn't know me. It was as if I was trying to walk up the side of hill of feathers. I looked at her. I listened to her talk, but there was nothing I could do. I truly believe that if ever a state social agency destroyed a family, it destroyed ours. We wanted and tried to stay together. Our home didn't have to be destroyed, but the welfare, the courts, and their doctor gave us the 1, 2, 3 punch, and ours was not the only case of this kind. I knew I wouldn't be back to see my mother again because it could make me a very vicious and dangerous person, knowing how they had looked at us as numbers and as a case in their book, not as human beings, and knowing that my mother in there was a statistic that didn't have to be, that existed because of a society's failure, hypocrisy, greed, and lack of mercy and compassion. Hence, I have no mercy or compassion in me for a society that will crush people and then penalize them for not being able to stand up under the weight. I have rarely talked to anyone about my mother, for I believed that I am capable of killing a person without hesitation who happened to make the wrong kind of remark about my mother. So I purposely don't make any opening for some fool to step into. Back then, when our family was destroyed in 1937, Wilfred and Hilda were old enough so that the state let them stay on their own in the big four-room house that my father had built. Filbert was placed with another family in Lansing, Mrs. Hackett, while Reginald and Wesley went to live with a family called Williams, who were a friend of mother's, and Owain and Robert went to live with a West Indian family named McGuire. Separated though we were, all of us maintained fairly close touch around Lansing in school and out wherever we could get together. Despite the artificially created separation and distance between us, we still remained very close in our feelings towards each other. So the last passages recounts the complete mental deterioration of Louis Little, their mother, and she was placed in a mental asylum in Kalamazoo. The entire family got separated, and the children got really affected by everything. And now Malcolm says that if there is a physical sickness in a person, then it can be cured, there is medicine for it. But if it is a mental sickness, then that affects the entire family. And now their mother had just become a number or a case in the government records. Later on, they were able to bring her back to their homes, and Filbert and family took care of her. But still, he says that their entire family was destroyed by the welfare system because of the lack of compassion from the welfare system. In a way, it is the welfare system, the state welfare system, that destroyed Louis' mental health, right? Louis Little's mental health. Because they were the ones who tried to label her as a crazy woman, and in the end, she did become a crazy woman. And towards the end of her life, towards the later part of her life, Louis Little was not even able to recognize her own children. At one instance, he was able to recognize Filbert in spots, but then again, she was not able to recognize Malcolm, and this truly ached him. And that is why Malcolm says that if ever a social system has completely destroyed a family, then he can undoubtedly say that it is their family. So, the social agency completely destroyed Malcolm's family. And in a way, the woman was pushed to insanity by the same people who were supposed to take care of her. The welfare put immense pressure on her that Louis Little slowly became insane. The children were separated from each other, they were put in the care of different people, and all this affected the children too. Though they were separated, they all kept close touch with each other. They would visit each other in Lansing schools, but still they were all separated in person, right? Still they had strong feelings towards each other. Even though they were separated, they had strong feelings for each other. And another thing that Malcolm says is that he stopped talking about his mother to anyone, because if he tells them that his mother is in an insane hospital or in a lunatic asylum, then people would just make remarks on her. And he says that he would kill a person who would make an unfavorable remark on behalf of his mother, because he hated anyone to make a passing remark on his own mother. Nevertheless, the entire family, they stayed together in spirit. Though they were separated, they stayed together in spirit. And that is how the entire extract comes to an end, reminding us that no matter what the welfare state does, No matter what the welfare state say that they are doing for the greater good of humanity. But in reality, they are just tearing apart families. But in the end, even though they were torn apart, the siblings, they all remained very close with each other. They had strong feelings for each other. And that was all that mattered. We come to an end to today's lecture. Thank you for listening. Take care.